Hey, all you rad dads out there.
Ani, bonjour, Waubgeshig Rice, Wasauksing First. Hi, everybody. My name is Waubgeshig Rice. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe of Wasauksing First Nation. That's on Georgian Bay near Parry Sound, Ontario. I'm of mixed Anishinaabe and Canadian descent, and I currently live in Sudbury, Ontario, which is the traditional territory of Waubgeshig and Anishinaabe. This place is also known as Swakamuck, and the lands where I currently reside and I am originally from are under the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, and that is, of course, a treaty that predates Canadian Confederation. And I am a dad, I'm an author, freelance journalist, and I live here with my wife, Sarah, and our two sons, Jiikwis and Ayaabehns. And yeah, just super stoked to join you. And just side note, my friends call me Waub for short, and you may as well.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Yeah, appreciate that introduction. You, I think, had up until very recently, a journalism career. Is that right? And then are you still doing that?
I more or less do it on the side. I worked in broadcasting for almost 20 years, mostly at CBC. I graduated from the university formerly known as Ryerson, or soon to be formerly known as Ryerson, in Toronto back in 2002. And I worked freelance for a couple of years in Toronto. I started working part-time at the Weather Network as a news writer and as a TV reporter. And eventually an opportunity came up at CBC in Winnipeg in 2006. And that's sort of where my CBC journey began. I worked there for 4 years, then moved back to Ontario to work in Toronto at CBC there for a summer. And then I moved to Ottawa in the fall of 2010, and I worked there for 7 years as a video journalist, which is essentially a TV reporter that shoots and edits their own stories.
Cool.
And that's where I met my wife, and our first son, Jiikwis, was born there in 2016. And we had our sights set on Sudbury for a while, my wife and I, because we are both sort of from the area. Sudbury is kind of a midpoint between our home communities. She grew up in the Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario area. Her lineage goes back to Garden River First Nation. So yeah, I worked here in Sudbury mostly as a radio reporter, but then eventually as a radio host for the afternoon show called Up North, which covers all of Northern Ontario. But I left my full-time job at CBC in May of last year to work primarily on fiction. And that's mostly because I had some great opportunities come up in terms of the literary world, and decided to sort of take that plunge. At CBC, it's colloquially known as the mothership internally. So when people leave, they say they jumped off the mothership, right? So yeah, so I've been working as an author primarily for the past year and a half, but also dipping in and out of freelance journalism, occasional work for CBC, you know, other publications in Canada as well.
Okay. And you're a dad. How old are your kids?
Our older son, Jiikwis, will be turning 5 in December, and our younger son, Ayaabehns, is about 16 months. So he was born in June of 2020, sort of a couple months into the pandemic.
And sorry, is it pronounced Ayaabehns?
Ayaabehns, yeah.
Ayaabehns. Okay, right on. So pandemic baby. So that's an interesting experience.
Yeah, it was interesting in the beginning. Well, it was really special, you know, because it sort of really gave us a hyper focus of that experience once again, you know, because we were so internalized here at home. And excited about welcoming him here, you know, and this was during like the first months of the pandemic when things were just so mysterious and confusing, right? So it gave us something, I think, really to look forward to, despite all that mystery. And here in Sudbury back then, there weren't that many cases, so there weren't huge restrictions in the hospital. So I was able to go into the delivery room and be there for his arrival. So it was great. Yeah, it was a huge I guess moment, obviously, you know, our second child is being born, but like to have it happen during the pandemic at its beginning was pretty intense at the same time, but in a good way.
Right. And yeah, you've got that time to almost sort of that permission from the world to like focus on on family at that time, right? I've kind of heard that from a few people who had children during the pandemic that, well, first of all, there's that thing where you just had a new baby and you're, cautious about who's coming around and are they cleaning their hands and all that kind of stuff. That would have been sort of like, hyper real at that time. But then to be able to just focus, right, is kind of a neat, unique experience for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And also it was shortly after I left my full-time job at CBC. So I had a little bit more flexibility in my schedule just to be with my wife and our older son. And because like it was right at the start of summer, the weather was good. So whenever we had visitors, we could just go in the backyard and, take precautions that way. It was a good time for sure.
How's the transition from 1 to 2 been?
Oh, man, it's so funny because so many other parents, I wouldn't say warned me and us, but kindly advised us about the big shift that we were about to get into. But it is major. Having 2 is an entirely different ball game, and of course it's been hugely challenging but rewarding at the same time, because they're at the ages now where they're really starting to develop their relationship with each other as brothers. Cool. And you're seeing them really be mindful of each other and really start to care about each other, but also, start to annoy each other as little kids do, which is like entertaining for me to see because, I had younger brothers too. And I'm sort of seeing that dynamic unfold at the same time. But yeah, man, having 2 is hard. It's a challenge, but you just got to take the blessings and the rewardings on the other hand of that.
Yeah, for sure. It's keeping that perspective, right?
Yeah.
Seeing through that challenge, right?
Yeah.
So I kind of want to pick up on something you mentioned about sort of getting to go to the hospital with the birth of your second child. You documented the birth of your first son, Jiikwis, and that was a bit of sort of a challenging event that happened. So maybe for anyone who hasn't kind of read that, I read through it on your website. Would you mind sort of sharing a little bit about what that experience was like and maybe how it was different with your second son?
Oh yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, our first son was born under very dire circumstances. My wife's pregnancy up until, this pretty traumatic moment was very good. She was progressing in a very healthy way. Her midwife was very pleased with how things were going. And then one night, this was about a month before her due date, she wasn't feeling that well. She was up in the night, having, an upset sort of stomach and just generally not feeling great. So we got up the next morning and she had, fortunately, coincidentally, a midwife's appointment that morning. So she's like, yeah, I'm not really feeling good at all. And I said, well, do you want me to take you to the midwife? And she said, no, I think I can handle it. So she drove over to the clinic, and I went to work at CBC, and I was covering a story at a hotel downtown and, shooting some interviews, and I put my phone away. And then after I was done shooting, I went back to get my phone, and, I had all these missed calls, and it was both, the midwife's office and my work, because they'd been trying to reach me through work. And what had happened was she had a seizure while she was in the midwife's office. Goodness. And the ambulance had to come and take her to the hospital, which was fortunately just a few blocks away in Ottawa. So they said, come down to the hospital right away. She's collapsed, something's going on. And I went down there, and I went to the ER because I thought that's where they would have her. But I didn't realize that they'd taken her right up to this sort of maternity ward right away. Right. So sort of waiting around the ER trying to figure out what was going on, and they couldn't locate her within the system, right? Because they didn't really have time to process her. They just took her right up to the place. So after I think 15 or 20 minutes, finally, like the midwife's office called me again. They're like, where are you? And I said, well, I've been waiting here in the ER to see what's going on. And they said, oh, you got to go up to the 4th floor, the maternity ward. So I said, okay. And they said, yeah, she's up there with your son. And it was like, wow, oh my God, and it was like that sort of cliched kind of movie moment where everything goes into slow motion, right?
Yeah.
And I stood up in the waiting room of the ER, asked where the elevator was, walked down the hall, and like everything was just, my mind was just swirling. And I took the elevator up to the fourth floor, and there was a whole team of like doctors and nurses there. And I was like, oh, this cannot be good at all. But they were all very kind and very helpful and careful with how they explained it to me. And they just basically told me the whole thing, that she ended up with a serious spell of high blood pressure, which is eclampsia. And as a result, she had a seizure. And then the baby's heart rate began to drop. So they took her in for an emergency C-section right away. So it was a huge shock to learn all of this. And I wasn't really able to process it at the same time. So they're like, well, your son's in this room. Do you want to come see it?
Yeah.
I was like, well, this is the last thing I expected to do today.
Right.
Yeah, sure. Let's go see my son. So they took me into like one of the recovery rooms, and there he was, on a table, the metal table. And they're like, no, we got to get him into the ICU right away. Just wanted to show you. And just, it was sort of like shock after shock throughout the rest of the day. Like my wife Sarah had to go into the ICU too. She had to be intubated and everything.
Oh my goodness.
So it was just a really, really traumatic event, but fortunately, as the day progressed, things got better. They both had to stay in the hospital for about a week, recovering from this moment. So it was rough. Absolutely. It was really hard. And I really didn't, grasp the post-traumatic stress that I was living with for about a year after that. Right. So I eventually went to counseling about a year, when his first birthday was coming up. I just had a lot of like spells of, some anxiety. I'm not really necessarily sure what it was I was feeling, but it wasn't great. So I made an appointment to see a counselor, and we moved to Sudbury by that point. And this counselor was able to help me move through, that trauma that I'd endured, and how that's the birthday, what was supposed to be a joyous, monumental event for us was triggering me,
Right.
But we worked through it. My wife, obviously very supportive. She was the one, obviously, who almost died. It was obviously worse for her because physically she had to endure this this medical crisis. And our son, he knows now like what happened. I don't think it really impacts him either way at this point. Like maybe when he's older, he'll sort of wrap his head around the seriousness of that event. So having this recent birth of our second guy was like totally different because everything went really well. And, my wife had a great medical team, like a midwife and a doctor here in Sudbury, who were well aware of what happened last time and wanted to mitigate any potential risks with the second birth. But everything went well. And for me, it was like, I don't want to say it wasn't emotional. Of course, it was like really happy and really exciting to welcome our second son. But like, I had so many other emotions that I had to resolve with our first son that like, the novelty of a first child was already gone. So I was able to like, I was excited. I was like, wow, this is so cool to be able to witness this event, this birth of our son. So I think I was like very keen and very eager just to, be there. May have been annoying for my wife because I was like, oh, here he comes, blah, blah, blah. Meanwhile, she's like pushing away. Right. So yeah, it was much more relaxed compared to the first time, but still it's interesting to have both of those experiences. But yeah, like those sort of hard things really fade over time, especially the more you're able to talk about them. And also as you see your children flourish, as you see them grow and be healthy and happy and so on, it's like, okay, these are the moments to really hang on to. And the ones that we endured and, they survived are sure noteworthy, of course, but we have this wide future to look forward to, so.
Right. Like, look, for his entry into the world, it was sort of so traumatic for everybody. And then to look 5 years later and see, well, it's just, happy, normal playing child, right? It's such a weird thing.
It
As
is.
I read through your story on your website too, we had a very similar experience, me and my wife. So we have two children as well. First one, very traumatic kind of experience in the beginning. She's totally fine now. Both of them are fine. But my second daughter was, totally uneventful. And I agree with you. Like I felt like the whole time I was just on edge, like just waiting for the shoe to drop here. Like, when's it going to get into crisis mode here again? And it just wasn't that. So, in some ways I felt like it was almost hard to be totally present there because I'm just kind of, so stressed and worried. But
Yeah.
it's amazing that you sort of, you carry that with you, right? And slowly does get better over time. So
yeah, what's also interesting too is like you meet other dads who have experienced that. Like right now we're discussing that moment, right? And you sort of realize how not necessarily common, but how slightly ubiquitous it can be, to experience traumatic birth, but like I think for men there's really no sort of manual to go through that, right. Like I remember being in the hospital and thinking, like, I got to talk to people about this. But like, do I just call my buddies? Like, I remember being in the cafeteria at the hospital in Ottawa, thinking, like, do I burden someone with this? I'm going through a really rough time. And all my friends I called were all very supportive, the ones who were dads and the ones who weren't. And I was really thankful for that. But I think it's really positive to have these discussions now. And I think the more that parents in general realize how major these events can be, that's great for awareness, right?
Yeah, I think there's like a thing. I don't know if you sort of felt that way at all. And we can talk a little bit about maybe support in your family and your community and stuff like that. I want to talk about that. But I do think that there's kind of this, I don't know what it is, at least for me, you kind of feel like I need to figure this out on my own. Like, I'm a parent. This should come really easy to me. It should be totally natural. I should be able to figure this out. And I think in reality, when you talk to other parents, you realize, no, we're all just kind of floundering and nobody knows what to do. So I agree with you. Having these conversations is so helpful.
Yeah, for sure.
So this is a Rad Dad show. So I want to ask you, and we had kind of had a funny exchange on Twitter about it, but I want to ask you, do you consider yourself a rad dad?
I would hope I would be a rad dad. it depends on like the context of rad in today's sense, I asked my son if he thought I was rad, and I had to explain to him, of course, what rad meant. And I said, well, it kind of means cool. Do you think I'm a cool dad? And he said no. So I don't know, like it's going to be interesting to see what our kids consider is rad or cool as they grow up. How old are your kids, by the way, Brett?
So I have my youngest daughter is 2, just about 3, and my oldest daughter is 5, just about 6.
Okay, right on. Cool. Do they think you're rad, or?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think I think my youngest daughter, she probably has no concept of what that means. I think, well, this is an interesting question. So everybody defines rad a little bit differently. So maybe I'll let me flip it back to you.
Sure.
How do you define rad? What's a rad dad to you?
Well, I think a rad dad is someone who listens to interesting music, maybe someone who can play music too, but doesn't necessarily have to have music connected to it. Maybe someone who is, I guess, connected to some sort of subculture or counterculture, maybe not necessarily mainstream, maybe punk rock, maybe heavy metal, maybe underground hip hop, all those things I think are rad. I guess to not necessarily push against conventions, but to sort of be adjacent to them and do your own thing at the same time, right?
So it's like individuality.
Yeah, individuality, exactly.
It's kind of what it is. So like bringing yourself as a person into being a parent, is that kind of what it is?
Yeah, I think so. I think of course, because they're like guides you can read, there's advice you can get from other parents, there are shows you can watch and so on. And of course, a lot of those things are common sense, and a lot of them are rooted in raising happy and healthy kids, which is what we all want to do and should do, right? But yeah, being rad, I think, involves injecting a little bit more of your personality into it. And I think showing kids that, there are other options for their interests, whether it be music or even sports or culture, whatever else, outside of what, they may be exposed to, like in the mainstream school system or on mainstream TV or on the radio or whatever else, right? So I think like I've always existed outside of those things, being a Anishinaabe guy who grew up on the reserve. Yeah, I think now that our kids obviously are growing up in a city, showing them that there are other ways of life other than the city and everything that they're sort of involved in now is part of being rad.
So how do you bring that personality into your parenting journey? And maybe how do you talked about sort of growing up on the reserve, now you're living in the city. How do you bring that to your children, your experiences growing up?
Well, to answer the first part, I think it's important not to overthink it. I think it's important just to be yourself, and those natural elements will reveal themselves. They'll come out. Your kids will receive them, both directly and indirectly, right? And I think that a big part of that is being true to yourself and not, putting up any sort of front about who you are. Because kids are so smart, they can see through anything, right? Even at 4 and 1.5, which my kids are now, so yeah, I think being true to yourself, I think, will come out naturally, and your kids will absorb that in good ways. In terms of like bringing my own upbringing into the picture, that requires a lot more effort. But one of the main reasons we moved to Sudbury was to be closer to our home communities. So Ottawa is a 5-hour drive from my home community of Wasauksing First Nation.
Right.
But now we're only an hour and a half away. So we have a place. We built a cabin there many years ago before our kids were born. So and a lot of my family still lives there, so we go down there and visit regularly. And on the other side, in the other direction, my wife's home communities are a little bit farther, but we still take them there to visit with their grandparents and their aunts and uncles and everything too. So for me, yeah, it's an entirely different kind of childhood when you compare being in a city like Sudbury to the reserve where I'm originally from. But having that exposure for them is important for me, and having that place accessible to them and their family accessible to them, I think is the next best thing, even though they can't grow up there like I did. At the same time, they know the place, they know the family, they know the roots. And of course, our younger guy is not as aware of this yet,
Right.
but he will grow up with that influence, and that makes me proud. That makes me happy. Of course, I would ideally like to raise them there, but that's just not in the cards at the moment. But maybe a few years down the line, we'll explore some options.
You kind of mentioned, things like teachings from family and from elders, and I've read some things that you've written on your website as well about that. Like how do you sort of incorporate that sort of that historical past into your parenting? How has that shaped you as a parent, and how do you work that into your approach as a parent?
Yeah, that's really fun to try to figure out, because again, if you overthink it, I think you're going to stress yourself out, right? So I just consider the examples that I was raised with, and it was really being around tangible things and being involved in specific activities like ceremonies that really did it for me, So it could be something as simple as pulling out the hand drum and singing some songs, or having a smudge, like burning like a traditional medicine like sage or sweetgrass, and doing that with our kids, because behind every action, behind every ceremony or every song is a story, is a lesson. So we take those they're teachable moments essentially, right? And we use those to show them what their culture is, who they are as Anishinaabe, what is available to them. And a big part of it is making time for their family, like their elder family members who do have a strong sense of culture and of history. and make sure that they spend time with them. Not necessarily like to hear the big long stories or to hear any sort of comprehensive explanations or descriptions of culture and history, but just to be around those people, right? To establish those relationships and let them know that these people are there for them, to teach them about who they are as Anishinaabe, right? And that's really how I learned. I learned by being immersed in the culture, by growing up in my community, and by knowing that I can go to my elders for guidance whenever I need to, right? So it's a way of like paying that forward and keeping that circle strong in many ways.
Can you speak to your children's names and
Yeah.
how those sort of came about?
Yeah, for sure. Well, when I was coming into this world, when my mother was pregnant for me, both my parents were living in Ottawa. They were both going to university at the time. And they were young, much younger than I was when I had my first kids. They were just in their early 20s. But they decided that they wanted to start the family, to raise their kids in my dad's home community. And my mom's of settler descent. She's a white Canadian, but this was something that was very important to her as well. So they made the decision to drop out of university and go to Wasauksing and start life there. And a part of that was deciding to raise their kids with Anishinaabe names. So they went to my grandmother, my father's mother, and said, we want to give our kid who's coming a name in the language. And she suggested giving me my great grandfather's name, which is Waubgeshig. And if you translate that directly, it sort of means like white sky, but it also refers to the color of the sky before the sun comes up. So I was born in 1979. I'm 42 years old, and I grew up in the 80s and 90s with this firm connection to my culture, my language, my community, and my family. Every time I speak my name and introduce myself, right, I am paying homage to all those connections. And, I've never taken that for granted. I've always been very serious about it. There were times when I was younger when I'd be teased about my name by kids who, weren't familiar with the culture of the language, and I would be frustrated then. But what prevailed always was this sense of awareness and of understanding. And I just love that I was able to grow up that way, that I always say that the greatest gift my parents gave me besides life itself was my name, because every day it's kept me connected to my culture and my people, my community. And I wanted the same thing for my kids. And my wife was obviously very dedicated to that as well as someone who's also of Anishinaabe descent. She wanted to make sure our kids had Anishinaabe names. So we did something similar. When she was pregnant with our first guy, I gave my dad an offering of tobacco, and I said, can you please find a name for our child? And he said, yeah, absolutely. He'd be honored to. So at that time, my grandmother was still alive, and he sort of consulted with her, and she advised the name Jiikwis. And if you translate that directly, it can mean like a big brother or firstborn or older son, right? But it's also a reference to a character in some really old stories, really old Anishinaabe stories. So Jiikwis was the older brother of a character named Nanabojo. And these are really long stories. I won't get into the details of those, but that's how we got the name Jiikwis for our older son. And our second son, the same thing. I said to my dad, here's some tobacco. Can you please, find a name for us? We both did, obviously, my wife and I. And same thing. He came up with Yaabe, which sort of means like buck, like male deer.
Yep.
Yeah. And that was inspired by a dream he had. So that's how those names came along. And it was influenced and inspired by my own upbringing.
That's so cool. To be able to involve your dad and your grandmother and other family members in that sort of process of finding a name for your child. Must create such a, I guess, strengthen that bond.
Yeah, for sure.
Through that process.
Yeah. And, like I tell the story of my name, and they'll be able to tell the stories of their names growing up. Another bonus is it took the pressure off us as parents to come up with names, right? So we weren't losing sleep over what to call our kids, because we knew that when they were born, my dad would visit and give them their names, right? So it's pretty cool.
Right. So we maybe touched on this a little bit, but your dad, like what was your relationship like with your dad sort of growing up, and how has that impacted, I guess, your parenting today?
My dad and I are very close. We always have been. I have two younger brothers, and he's always been close with them as well. He had a very difficult childhood himself, in that his dad died tragically when my dad was only about 5 years old.
Oh, wow.
So he essentially got drunk and fell out of a boat and drowned, right? And left my grandmother to
Wow.
raise 5 kids on her own on the reserve. And she later adopted 2 more kids. But what's always really interesting to consider about my grandmother is this was in the 1960s, sort of at the peak of Indigenous child apprehension in Canada.
Yeah.
So there was the risk of, this single mother having 5 children and all these kids being taken away either to residential school or as part of the 60 scoop into the child welfare system, right? Somehow she was able to resist that. And I think, my theory is, having known my grandmother very well, is that she really established herself as a firm community member, not just in Wasauksing, where we're from, but also in Parry Sound, Ontario, the adjacent town. So she was a strong advocate. She was very political. And I think people just generally didn't want to mess with her, right? She was a really strong Anishinaabe woman. So because of that, her kids weren't taken away from her. But my dad tells me stories about when he was a kid. She used to tell them, if you see a car with white men come into the community, run into the bush, because they might be here to take you away. And that was real. That was a real thing. These could have been, the Indian agents or, child welfare workers or whoever else coming to take the kids away, right? So my dad had that really difficult upbringing, raised by a single mother with all the pressures and abuses of the colonial system all around him at all times, right? So, he, I think, didn't necessarily have a template to follow of being a father. And he really had to figure it out all on his own. And he was 24 when I was born, so quite a young man considering. I think he worked really hard to find a way to raise me and my brothers in a good way, and also to use the culture that he was reconnecting with as part of his guidance, to do that. And a big part of that was sort of pushing back against sort of Western notions of what being a father is, which are very macho in many ways, right? It's be tough, don't show emotion, don't do the sort of womanly things, quote unquote, like changing diapers or pushing carriages or anything like that. So I think he wanted to, in many ways, reclaim what some Indigenous virtues around fatherhood were. And I think we were raised in a more, I guess, inclusive and I think positive way. So that for me set me on my path to fatherhood, seeing that as an example. But he really had to do that a lot on his own to figure that out. At the same time, hugely supported by my mother, my mother was there to join him on this journey of cultural reclamation as a white woman, and I give her equal credit for how we were raised, because she wanted to ensure we had that influence as well. So yeah, those, both of my parents, taught me how to be a father, but also it was people like my grandmother that I mentioned, and my grandparents, my mother's parents, and all our aunts and uncles, because that whole generation really came together at a time when reconciliation wasn't even part of the national vocabulary at all, but they came together as Anishinaabe and Canadian families to ensure that, us as kids and all our cousins grew up together in a happy way, and I always feel very fortunate for that. And that's sort of the example that I try to follow with my own kids.
I love that. How has becoming a father changed you?
Geez, in so many ways, I think it's definitely made me more patient. I try to consider myself as a patient person in general, but it has taught me really to savor the time that I do have. And for me, part of that is, I think, pushing back against the standards I set for myself in my professional career, because I essentially worked 2 careers for almost 20 years, right? As a journalist and as an author. But having kids really showed me that it's important to slow things down and to savor the moments, even when, they're screaming at 3 a.m.
Right.
Because, we're not going to get those times back, right? Even as challenging as some of those times are. But it's also taught me to be more open-minded about the world, and to really, I think, be open to learning from my own children, because they are the ultimate teachers. I am learning every day from them, not just about life itself, but about myself as a person, about, childhood development, because you see that on a daily basis, but also about the importance of creating a good future, because you have the future basically running around in front of you, and like, if you can't be inspired and find dedication to forge a better, healthy future for us all as a society, then I don't know why you would want to be a parent if you don't see those beautiful things in your own life right in front of you, So they inspire me to be a better person and to try to be a better community member and citizen of this earth. These are things I always took seriously before, but I take them way more seriously now. And it's just a reminder every day of how important these moments are, and these relationships that we build are, so
it's totally easy to get wrapped up in yourself, right? And in this world, and lose maybe perspective, like you're talking about the big picture. Right. And kids are so good for putting those things in perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not easy, right?
No,
not easy.
No.
We talked about patience, right? Learning patience. That's one I feel like is you're always having to work on.
Yeah.
They're very good at testing it, but
yeah. The other thing is like more like audible sort of ear care, man, I would go to shows in Toronto when I was living there, like at the Opera House or at Lee's Palace, seeing like bands like High on Fire or the Dillinger Escape Plan, and never wear earplugs, right? And just sort of take that for granted. But the volume coming from these children, man, sometimes it's like, it dwarfs all that stuff that I heard before, So it's like, oh man, I'm 42 now, and I really got to, make sure I can still hear these guys when I'm 52, right? So, but that's the volume.
It's so funny. I'm the same way. I feel like I totally ruined my ears earlier in life, and I'm always like, what's going on? And so I guess to get back to maybe some of the conversation we had before in terms of your individuality, you sort of talked about music being important to you. So I know sort of, through our mutual online acquaintances and things like that, you're into, metal and stuff like that. So let me ask you, how do you sort of show that to your kids, or how do you, I guess, introduce that idea? You're probably not sitting down and putting Master of Puppets on and like getting your 16-month-old to listen, but but how do you sort of work that in?
Well, a big part of it is having music on all the time. And that's just something that I've always done, sort of have music going in the background, whether it's like doing the dishes or actually working or whatever else. So, I try to switch it up, and like, we're fortunate this day and age that we have like, Spotify or Apple Music accounts, and we can put on any sort of stream, right? Any sort of genre. So that's basically what I do. I'll put on the classic rock genre, I'll put on the hip hop genre, or whatever else. And then our older son, Jiikwis, if he says, oh, I like this song, I have a separate playlist for him. Okay. So I'll say, do you want me to put this on your playlist? And he'll say, yeah. So it's funny, like I'll pull up his playlist now on my phone, and it's this totally random mishmash of things, it's like AC/DC, Bowie, he really likes Bowie, cool. The Weeknd, the Ramones, Green Day, the Ghostbusters theme, Rise Against, MIA, Red Hot Chili Peppers. So like that's sort of, I wouldn't say it's a strategy, but I just want to ensure that he is exposed to these things and he can find what he likes. And that's what my parents did for me. You know, they would put on cassettes of like Willie Nelson or Neil Young or Joni Mitchell, Pink Floyd, The Who, you know, just the stuff they were into back then, Sly and the Family Stone, Ray Charles, whatever else, right?
Nice.
And like at the time, you know, I wasn't really that interested in them, but you know, that creates a good foundation. And I love all that stuff now, obviously, you know. But I think what that did for me was inspired me to seek out different kinds of music. And, you know, in my teens and sort of into my early 20s, I listened to basically all of it, you know. And when I moved to Toronto for university, man, it was like the world being my oyster kind of thing, right? Because it's like there's all kinds of live music happening all the time. And it was just so exciting, you know, back in the late 90s, early 2000s to be a part of that. So yeah, I give credit to my parents again for just making sure I had an open mind to music. And eventually that, you know, evolved into the heavier stuff, you know. So.
Yeah, I love that idea of creating a playlist, and then those moments, because we have those too, where my kids don't love the music that I listen to, but I kind of every once in a while force it on them a little bit, right? In the car, like they're like, oh, let's put on something different. I'm like, no, we're going to listen to this for now. But then they'll pick up on some song or some chorus or whatever that they're like, oh, I like that.
Yeah.
I love that idea of just like right in that moment, let's pop that on a playlist for them. Because I guess there's a tendency, I think, with kids, or at least I feel this sometimes for me, like to just put on sort of what's easy, what they like. But it's so rewarding when they start to identify with a song that you really love, right? Like you kind of share that experience with them.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Yeah, the funny thing is Bowie, like he for some reason Jiikwis has just really gravitated towards David Bowie. And we went to the record store here in Sudbury a couple months ago, and there were Bowie records on the wall, and he was like, oh look, David Bowie records. And there were other people in the record store, and man, I felt like the coolest dad for a couple minutes there, because like he recognized the Bowie records, right? So it was cool.
That's awesome. That's awesome. What's next for you? What are you working on these days? I have some idea about what you're working on, but let's tell the listeners and the viewers what's coming next for you.
Sure. Well, I am currently deep into the next draft of my next novel. It's called Moon of the Turning Leaves, and it is the sequel to my last novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow. So if all goes according to schedule, it will be out about a year from now. So in the fall of 2022. So that is pretty much my focus for the next, probably for the entire fall and winter, is to just get these subsequent drafts done so that we can sort of put the book to bed. But it's, you know, I don't want to jinx anything, knock on wood, but my editor and I are both pretty excited about how it's taking shape.
Awesome.
And, you know, we are both really stoked to get the story out there. So yeah, that is mainly what I'm doing now. You know, just some other random writing gigs on the side. And also a friend of mine, her name's Jennifer David, and we do a podcast called Story Keepers.
Right.
And it's sort of a monthly book club podcast focused on Indigenous literature. So yeah, those are the things I'm up to at the moment.
Awesome. So I want to just quickly touch on your book, Moon of the Crusted Snow. So for people who haven't or maybe aren't aware of your book, can you just give like a little I guess brief rundown of maybe what the book's about? Because you're working on the sequel right now. My understanding is you never sort of planned a sequel, but it was a very well received book. It's very cool. I'm sort of halfway through it right now. We were talking before, and it's just awesome. So yeah, maybe give us the little rundown of Moon of the Crusted Snow.
Yeah, sure. And thanks a lot for reading it. I really appreciate that. Moon of the Crusted Snow is basically a post-apocalyptic story from the perspective of a Northern Ontario First Nation. And this community experiences what they find out to be a world-ending blackout. But because they are in the north and they are sort of more closely connected to the land, some of the community members are able to adapt more easily to this crisis than others. But then out of the blue, some characters come up from a city to the south and look to impose their will upon the people and essentially take over the community. So it becomes an exacerbated crisis in that the community has to make some decisions about what to do about these outsiders while trying to survive at the same time. So it's about the moment of collapse and what a community decides to do. So yeah, it was mostly inspired by the big blackout of the summer of 2003. And just also being a fan of post-apocalyptic or dystopian literature since I was a teenager, right? I always wanted to write one of those stories of my own. So yeah, I wrote it more or less as a one-off, and I just sort of left that story to be because I was sort of done with it, right? I had set out what I aspired to do in creating this story. But fortunately for me, very fortunately, there was a lot of buzz around it. It was very well received. People started asking about a sequel, and as the sort of years went on, it's been out for 3 years now. My agent said, you got to give the people what you want, come up with a sequel. If you come up with a good idea, I'll find you a book deal. And that's sort of what happened. But the way that all came together meant that I couldn't fit that into my career as a CBC radio host. So I had to make the decision to leave CBC.
Right.
But that was all obviously carefully planned. I lined up a lot of other work in the lead up to my actual departure from CBC. So to give a little hint about the sequel, it picks up about 10 years after the end of the first book. And the community in the first book, one detail about it is the people who inhabit it were originally they originally lived in sort of the Georgian Bay area where I'm originally from, but part of the story is they were displaced to far northern Ontario. So in part 2, they want to go back to their homelands but also see what's left of the world after the end, kind of thing, right? So it's more or less a quest story. It's at this point it's much longer than the first book.
Okay.
So there's a lot more editing that we're going to have to do, but I very much see it as a bonus story. Like for me, I wasn't planning on writing it, and it was just super fun to get into and sort of revisit and bring these characters back to life. And it sounds weird to say, yeah, it was fun to write, more about the end of the world,
right.
the chaos that follows, kind of thing. But yeah, I just feel very fortunate and blessed that my path has led me here, and that's people want to see what's next for these characters.
Yeah, and the character, we were talking about this before we sort of got started, the character development is so good. It's like this slow burn in the beginning. It's like a really good sort of thriller almost, where you just know something's coming, right? You kind of fall in love with these characters right off the beginning. So yeah, I can't wait
thanks
for the next book. Where can people find you online if they want to check out your work or your podcast?
Sure. Well, I guess the easiest place to find me is on social media. So I'm on Twitter at Waub, that's at WAUB. I'm on Instagram with the same handle at WAUB. You can find my page on Facebook at Waubgeshig Rice, my full name. I do have a website. It's just waub.ca. That hasn't been updated in about a year though. So I gotta, get some blog posts up there just to let people know what's up. And yeah, the Storykeepers podcast, you can find it on pretty much most podcast platforms. The website is storykeeperspodcast.ca. So you can get an idea of the books that we discuss there. And I think that's it. I think that's basically the extent of my digital footprint.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate you spending some time with me this morning, chatting about parenthood, chatting about your experience as a dad, talking about some of your work. Any message that you want to leave for dads out there listening, or maybe dads to be?
Yeah, well, thanks, Brett. I really enjoyed this conversation with you. I'm very honored to have had this experience. I think it's really fun to talk about parenthood, fatherhood specifically. My message to other, I guess, new dads or dads to be is to really, I think, consider the community that you're a part of, and understand that you don't necessarily have to go it alone, that there are other dads and other moms who can be there for you. And even if you can't reach out to those people in real life, look for them online. I have found a lot of support online when I needed it. And I think having that community sense in mind really pushes us forward to the future and makes us cognizant of the relationships we're creating too. I think because at the core level of parenthood, and there's a lot wrong with our world, right? There are a lot of differences that people sort of get up in arms about. And, it's tough, especially for, Black and Indigenous people who are dealing with racism. But I think when we see each other as counterparts, not just as parents, but as fellow community members, I think we have a good understanding of where we can go together, right? And that's the example that was set for me from a very early age, coming from a reserve that's beside a town that had, some unfavorable sort of perspectives of our own community on the reserve, right? So, it's just considering that community building that you can do, and just how parenthood is a good way into that, and how fostering those relationships that result from that camaraderie is a really cool thing, and it's a really special thing. And I think we can really grab hold of that to figure out what we're going to do in the future, because our kids are going to have a lot of challenges ahead of them. If we think about issues like climate change or potential future pandemics, because there will be more coming down the line. I think setting that example for them as good neighbors is going to help them create a good future. So to boil that all back down into sort of a cohesive, concise message is just that be a good community member, both as a parent and as a neighbor.
Look for support and provide support.
Look for support and provide support.
Yeah,
exactly. Don't be afraid to have the conversations, and I think as men specifically, as cis hetero men, we've been really shaped by sort of macho Western culture around us, and there's nothing wrong with being a strong, tough dad, but at the same time you do have to balance that with the vulnerability that your children need to see. The fully formed, balanced human beings that we are, our children deserve to see that. They need to see that in order to grow up as balanced, well-rounded people too. So sure, be a tough guy dad, but at the same time show your kids your own weaknesses too, because that's important for them to see. And that's I think good examples that we can set as human beings.
Love that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, Waub. It's really great to meet you. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come on the show.